Hello and welcome to this EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Arindam Rai, Assistant Professor in the University of Bardhaman, West Bengal. I shall be discussing with you today the social movement and nation state in India, and I am one of the contributor of this particular module. Well, before we go into detail, let us very briefly sum up what we propose to say over here. Well, I am going to discuss an issue which is one of the most contested issue of mainstream sociology, a relationship or interrelationship between social movement and nation states in India. You know, there is a diametrically opposite viewpoint on this particular relationship. There is one group of people who views that social movement is basically a pathological syndrome of a ailing system, whereas the other group hails it as a mark of social transformation. Now, instead of getting into either of this, binary, let us take it from a very different perspective, that there is a concrete processual relationship between these two. Now, in this particular module, we would like to discuss with certain illustrations, contemporary illustrations, how these two diametrically opposite perspectives are related. Now, as I said, that social movement and nation state constitutes to one of the, relationship between these two constitutes one of the more protracted issue of social science or mainstream social sociology. Generally, there are two different perspectives, as I just said. There is a diametrically opposite relationship between these two. On the one hand, social movement is basically addressed to a ailing system. Whenever social movement originates, it basically tries to correct some of the anomalies in the political system. The nation state, when it addresses this social movement, it actually tries to correct it. So they are in a way intertwined. Now here, I would like to cast some light on how these two diametrically opposite thing integrated, and with certain illustrations. Now, social mobilization often decides the future course of social movement, including the state responses to it. Now, for example, again, there is no uniform kind of a responses from the state. State response to social movement may vary from situation to situation, depending upon what kind of state you are referring to. In case of an authoritarian system, the responses to any kind of social movement is pretty simple. It takes as if it's a gross affront to the authority of the state. So you need to crush it at any cost. You did not want to flourish it. Sometimes there are responses not that hurts. Sometimes it is an accommodative kind of responses, what we call the facilitating type. There, if the ideology and the means of movement, there is a compatibility between these two, then there is a possibility that social movement may be facilitated by the state itself. Sometimes it is necessary for the state to sort of re-legitimizes itself. Sometimes the state response to social movements is of toleration. Well, state may tolerate. Sometimes the ideology may differ, but the modus operandi of the social movement may be along with the state what is necessary for the state. So state may tolerate that kind of movement. Sometimes state may discredit any social movements, and to that particular response, state may go on adopting outright repressive state apparatus to cross any social movements. So these four responses, as I have just mentioned, if I just categorize it, if I just try to enumerate these four responses of the state vis-a-vis social movement, then we can have four such responses. First one is facilitation steps. Second one is toleration. Third one, discreditation. And fourth one is repression. Now, when there is a congruence of ideology of the state and social movement, the means adopted by the mobilization is legitimate. In that case, state may facilitate a social movement. There are plenty of such examples in India where state is actually facilitating a social movement. Especially if we draw on an example of a socialist movement in India. You know, in India, socialist movement is very difficult because in a constitutional setup where socialist method of overhauling the entire political state structure is not possible. So they need to tone down their radical ideology in accordance with this parliamentary democratic model. So here, there are certain states where we have a socialist model of government, and there we find this kind of this kind of state approaches where state tries to facilitate social movements along with social movements in different state activities. Second, toleration. Now, toleration is when the ideology of a movement differs from that of the state, but not the means. You know, if means tally, then in that case, state may tolerate. Well, there are certain movements when state is not very happy with the kind of ideology of this particular movement, but the means they do not take outrightly oppressive kind of means. Then in that case, state may go on adopting or taking an approach of toleration, tolerate that movements. Third one is discreditation. In such a situation when ideology of a movement corresponds but not the means. There are so many examples out there when they have any social movement started with a very lofty goals, but sometimes it fails to carry forward that goals, and in the midway they've sometimes opted for certain oppressive kind of approaches, and that is again, state's response to social movement, as I said, just varies from one situation to another. Sometimes state may outrightly discredit a social movement. If there is an ideology of movement that corresponds to the state or nation state, but state may sometimes resort to discreditation if the means differ. There are several such examples where state had to discredit such social movements. And last but not least, that is the repression. State may resort to outright repressive measures to crush a social movement when a particular movement challenges the very raison d'etre of the state, the very legitimacy of the state to rule. If that got under challenge, then state would not go for these other soft option like facilitations or toleration or discreditation. State may go directly against it and try to quash that particular movement. But overall, there is a kind of a processual linkages between social movement and the nation states. Now, let us get into certain illustrations, how these states' responses to social movement vary from situation to situation. Now, if I take the first example, that one is what we call the case study one, that is felicitation. Now, that is the first one, how state facilitates a particular social movement. Well, if we look at the socialist movement in India, unlike the other parts of the globe, India's socialist movement has altogether a different, checkered history, because Indian social movement, India has a democratic constitutional framework, and within that constitutional framework, you can't expect to have a radical social transformation. So, the socialist movement in India had to, negotiate with this kind of constitutional framework and tone down its, radical gest to the constitutional form of governance, constitutional form of social change. Now, here, if we look at this kind of transformation of the socialist movement from the radical socialist movement to a parliamentary democratic model, there we find that several such socialist parties who have got themselves elected in different subnational states in India. And there, in those governments, if you take a look at those governments' attitude to social movements, there you find a clear approach of facilitation, where state tries to facilitate social movement, especially those social movements where the socialist ideologies, though moderated one, like pro-people, pro-poor, participatory model of governance. These are some of the issues where we find that state is actually facilitating social movement. There are several such social movements where socialist parties actually pampered, sometimes, uh, give them some support, moral support, impetus, so that this movement can be ultimately accommodated into their governance process, and that would bring, transform the government or governance into a better governance. Now, there's another, form of approach from the part of the state, that is we call the toleration. Now, what is the toleration? If the ideology may differ, but the approaches, I mean the means of social movement differs from one another, in that case, state may resort to the policies of what we call the toleration. For example, if we draw on the example of the Sarvodaya movement, which is, as you know, is eminently qualifies the state response of social movement. Ideologically speaking, this movement widely differs from that of the state, as it questions the very institution of private property, foregrounds an idealistic notion of collective ownership, trusteeship of property, etc. The uniqueness of this movement is that it didn't advocate any violent, extra-constitutional, coercive approach or measure to, overthrow a government. And that is perhaps the reason, despite some, quite revolutionary element into it, but state never see it as a challenge. And that is perhaps the reason state starts to tolerate this kind of movement. In case of Bihar, in other parts of the country, we can come across this kind of Gandhian Satyagraha movement. For example, passive resistance, for example, Padayatra, or what we call the protest walk, or the voluntary donation like Bhudan, the gift of land, Gramdan, the village, gift of village, or Sampatti Dan, that is the gift of property, or Bhumidan, the gift of knowledge. These are some of the examples where, these approaches, I mean, the ideology do not tally with that of the state, but the approaches or the means is never appear to the state as antithetical to the interest of the state. And that is perhaps the reason why state never discredit this kind of social movement, rather adopt a policy of tolerating them, because at the end of the day it carries certain values, certain quintessential humanly values, which is necessary for a society to thrive. Now, another kind of approaches that state often resort to is the principle of what we call the discreditation. Here, for example, if we look at the Gurjar movement in recent times, in recent past in the northern part of the country, initially that movement was not a threat to the state as such, because they were basically asking for certain reservations, certain protective shield for them, for those in the constitutional, within the constitutional bracket. But eventually that movement gone out of the proportion, and then it started creating a pandemonium across the northern part of the country, and started creating blockades, wasting and the public property, and then state had to respond. State in this kind of movements, state virtually discredit this entire movement, saying that it is antithetical for the interest of the public, or for the antithetical to the public interest. So this is a kind of approach that state often takes, that is the approach of discreditation. State discredit that, well, we don't accept this as at all a symbol of any movement. It has got certain element which is really antithetical to the public property and public order. Another, the most violent kind of approach state often resorts to, that is the repressionary approaches, where state outrightly quashes a particular movement. There are, again, examples are aplenty. Here we can draw on certain examples. For example, first one is the Lalgarh movement. Again, this movement began with a very gentle note. It was basically an incident of protesting police excesses. That incident took place in Lalgarh in the western Midnapur district of West Bengal, when one convoy of the then chief minister along with an union minister was being attacked, ambushed by certain vociferous groups, and police, as a retaliatory activities, state launched a huge offensive, which actually includes certain manhunt and searching and combing operations across this region. And as you know, that particular region is mostly covered by the dense forests, and those forests are being inhabited by the tribal peoples. In the process of this police operation, their very sentiment of these traditional tribal people got hurt, and they basically want respite from the state. They want certain correction, they want certain correctional measures on the part of the state. Instead of conceding to the demands of the tribal people, state went on rampaging their homes in the name of combing operation, and ultimately this entire apparently non-violent movement went on and converted into a violent one, where the local people, especially the tribals, they started cutting off this particular region from the rest of the state by digging the roads, by putting the tree trunks in the road, and almost declaring that particular region is liberated from the state of India. And as you know, that it itself is a threat to the integrity and the order of the state. So state had to intervene, and state, instead of listening to the villagers, to the poor marginal people, state went on arresting those people who were actually leading this movement, and virtually the entire movement being crushed. So this is one example how state actually opted for repressionary measures to address a kind of social movement which is not compatible with the state ideology, or the means of the movement is not acceptable to the state. Another example we can draw on is as you all know, nowadays it's quite easily we can come across this movement. That is the Singur movement, this famous land movement against the land acquisition. Singur movement was not only a movement, by a group of people who are being ousted from a particular land. It actually brings forth one of the protracted issue of development, that is development-induced displacement. Now, the entire story started like this. The last government, the then government, the then left-front government in West Bengal, after elected for the 7th consecutive terms with a thumping majority, they tried to translate that particular mandate into their developmental activities. So they launched a huge developmental offensives, and as a part of that, they came into a MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding with the Tata Motors Company to set up a car manufacturing unit in Singur, only 750 kilometers away from Calcutta. So initially, the movement begins as this proposed factory, mop up a huge tilling land, of which most of them are mostly fertile lands. So the people, especially the farmers, they do not accept this proposal. They want bring back the land. So state initially started giving them certain sops like compensation package, and compensation package was in fact one of the highest one in the country at that time. But despite that, a movement by these so-called oustees began, and that actually ultimately challenged the very future of that particular movement. So state initially soft peddling with this particular movement, trying to make them aware that this is for the benefit of this entire region. But when the movement gone out of their hand, they started, actions, the police actions, especially the repressionary actions. They had taken certain repressionary measures, and that actually created huge, that actually worsened the situation, and ultimately the Tata Motors had to withdraw from that very project. Now this is the story, and here the role of the state was especially repressionary, because initially state went on crushing this movement instead of engaging them into a dialogue. So the repressive measures on the part of the state cannot put out the ember of the movement. The resoluteness of these dispossessed people, led by the opposition leaders, ultimately stands vindicated, and Tata have decided to abandon the project. Though the incident is often projected as the death knell for the industrial prospect of the state, it also signifies the inherent strength of social movement. Moreover, the illegality of the Land Acquisition Act was exemplified by the Calcutta High Court, which categorically mentioned that the act had a provision of acquiring private land for public purpose, not for the private business. The social movement, so therefore, now if we, after those illustrations, if we come to this analytical part, then we can very easily mention that the social movement and nation states are reciprocally integrated. Whereas social movements are deliberately formed through collective mobilizations, including intending to bring about rapid social transformations. Institutions like states are the instrumentalities which have been guided against nation states to bring about certain changes or resist certain possibilities of change. So social movement act as a boon in disguise for institutions. If an institution keeps on ignoring the periodic challenges guided against it, there is a strong possibility that it may become structurally and culturally irrelevant. So therefore, social movement is not always a bane. Sometimes it proves to be a boon, because it gives you a wake-up call. It gives you a reality check that where went wrong. I mean, whether the governance process is altogether right or not. Because this occasional signaling actually saves you from becoming structurally and culturally irrelevant. Therefore, institution retains their relevance by being exposed to intermittent social movements. In other words, a social movement offers an institution with an unique opportunity of re-legitimization. So, social movements often provides you an opportunity to re-legitimize yourself. How and why you are still relevant, you can re-legitimize it only you allow social movements to occur. There are certain social systems, there are certain political systems where no such voice of the people being allowed. So if you just muzzle the voice of the people, if you stop congregating people in a space more than 2 or 3, then that means you are basically destroying, or you are basically making yourself irrelevant, because you would not get the reality check. You don't know what went wrong. When you actually understand, when you actually come across that problem, that time the problem will be blown out of proportion. So therefore it will be too late to respond. So institutions and movement are reciprocally linked into 3 significant ways. Now first, institutions and structures are cleansed by movements. The movements often cleansed a system. What are often labeled as fundamentalists or revivalist movements are essentially attempts to rescue institutions from their current stage of degeneration and render them back on track or back on their pristine purity as defined by the visionaries of those movements. Conversely, institutions tend to correct movements from their adventurism. There are certain movements which actually begins in a constitutional manner and then it goes haywire. So an institution has the sort of ability to correct a movement from falling into the trap of adventurism. Secondly, a movement deliberately creates institutions which are new vehicle to fulfill the present vision and aspirations. Similarly, institutions may float movements to sustain their legitimacy. As I have just mentioned, that there are institutions which wants to float certain social movements so that it can re-legitimize itself. And thirdly, the movement tends to redefine the old institutions. The effort being not simply to purify or inject institutions with new verbs and vitality, not to abandon them completely and create new ones, but to recreate them. So to conclude, in this entire module, what we have tried to do is, we had tried to show the interrelationship, the intricate interrelationship between social movements and nation state, and which constitutes one of the protracted issue of mainstream sociology. Now, generally, they are being put into two diametrically opposite terms. Sometimes a few people said that social movement is basically the symbol of a ailing system. It is basically a pathological syndrome, whereas other other challenges this particular proposition, saying that it is basically the mark of the regeneration of the system. So, despite the projecting them into a diametrically opposite version, there is a processual linkage between these two, and which sustains one another. If we look at the different social movements that I have just mentioned, there we can find that these two, social movements and nation state sustain one another, and therefore we should not treat them into two watertight compartments. Thank you, and for more information, please visit ePathshala websites and other references. Thank you.